Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Please continue eating. I'm Ed Georgian. I'm the director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to join the Associate Roundtable co-chairs Cody Sutton and Wesley Ward in welcoming you to our Associate Roundtable event. We're very happy to have you with us today. The title of the event is What FDR Can Teach President Obama and the Rest of Us. And it's being filled live by MSNBC, CNBC, Bloomberg News. No, don't panic. Everyone on Wall Street is trying to find out what's happening. I want to thank Cody and Wesley for their leadership in the Associate Roundtable and bringing this event together. I really appreciate it. Until recently, the Great Depression was a subject mainly of interest to historians. Now, as stocks reel and unemployment heads toward double digits, the 1930s and the New Deal are timely topics that engage commentators, politicians, and the general public alike. Many of the questions that the American people asked in the 1930s are being asked again today. What caused the crash? How do we climb out of the abyss? Is government spending the answer? Can federal regulations prevent markets from failing? Is the Fed the cause, or the problem, or the cure? History never repeats itself, I think, but what happened before might help us answer some of the questions that concern us now. This is true even though historians seldom agree about the past, and great historical debates, including debates about the 1930s, are rarely ever settled. Today, the Baker Institute will take the historical approach to the most pressing public policy issue that this nation currently faces. How did we get here, and where should we go? We are fortunate to have two leading presidential historians as our guides. They are Henry Brands and Douglas Brinkley. Henry Williams Brands earned his doctorate in history from the University of Texas at Austin. In 1987, he joined the history faculty at Texas A&M University, where he taught for 17 years. In 2005, he returned to the University of Texas, where he is the Dixon Allen Anderson Centennial Professor of History and Professor of Government. As you can see in your detailed program notes, he is a prolific author. His books include Traitor to His Class and The First American, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Prize, as well as the New York Times bestseller. Douglas Brinkley is our Baker Institute's Fellow in History and a Professor of History at Rice University. He completed his bachelor's degree at The Ohio State University and received his doctorate in U.S. diplomatic history from Georgetown University, my alma mater, good place. Before coming to Rice, Brinkley served as Professor of History and Director of the Theodore Roosevelt Center for American Civilization at Tulane University. From 1994 to 2005, he was the Stephen Ambrose Professor of History and Director of the Eisenhower Center for American Studies at the University of New Orleans. Brinkley's most recent publications include the Reagan Diaries, which he edited, and the Great Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, and the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which was a recipient of the Robert F. Kennedy Prize and a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award. He is currently writing a book on the conservation movement and Theodore Roosevelt. Gentlemen, we're very glad to have you help us navigate two of the most tumultuous, stressful times in American history. We look forward to your discussion. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for coming for this luncheon talk. I've known Bill Brands now for a long time. We were both started our careers in U.S. diplomatic history together, and we both enjoy writing biography a lot in recent years, and so we're personal friends, and I'm always a champion of when his books come out, and we were very excited by the new biography of FDR that's at the table over there, which we're going to hopefully have you all get, and Bill will sign it to you after our conversation and Q&A. I should say it just last week was chosen as one of the best books. It was nominated one of the 5 best biographies of the year by the Los Angeles Times Book Award, which is one of the 2 or 3 most prestigious book awards in the country, so we have to pull for Bill to win that award here in a couple of weeks. He lives in Austin and teaches at UT, as was said, but he's frequently here at Houston. We're hoping to get him to engage with the Baker Institute on some other programs down the line. Bill, I wanted to start today because I know you also wrote a book on Theodore Roosevelt. And so you've written biographies of both Roosevelts. What do the two have in common with each other? Or what did FDR learn from TR? And what are their differences?
The first thing that Franklin Roosevelt learned from Theodore Roosevelt is that he could be president. Franklin Roosevelt, I think, is one of two individuals to occupy the White House who, for 20 or 30 years before he became president, had a realistic expectation that he might actually be president. Of course, it's part of American mythology that any boy, and maybe now any girl, can grow up to be president, but most people realize that that's just a pipe dream. There are a few people, though, who understand, because they have some close personal connection to a president, as in, well, I said that there are two people. One of them was Franklin Roosevelt. Can you guess who the other one was? John Quincy Adams, whose father had been president. And I think this is really important in allowing people to figure out what they can be. My younger son, Riley, is with me today. His older brother, Hal, decided to become a historian. And Riley has chosen a different path. He wants to be a scientist. But Hal decided he wanted to be a historian, and I'm convinced that the reason he decided he wanted to be a historian is for years he would see me sitting around the house, not apparently working too hard, and figured, how hard can this history be? My old man can do it. So, well, I say this sort of half-jokingly, but this is what Franklin Roosevelt learned from Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was his fifth cousin, and then he became his uncle by marriage. And there's a whole story there as well as to exactly why did Franklin Roosevelt marry Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt. So, by the way, when they were married, Eleanor Roosevelt became Eleanor Roosevelt Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt, because Eleanor Roosevelt's parents had died, in particular her father had died, gave away the bride at the wedding and congratulated Franklin Roosevelt, saying, "Franklin, there's nothing like keeping the name in the family." But anyway, Franklin Roosevelt looked at Theodore Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was in college when Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House. And so he would go down and he would hang around the White House. And I'm sure, he never said this in a diary, he was rarely reflective on paper. But I can't help believe that he looked at Theodore Roosevelt, he looked at himself, and he said, I can do that. Now, the reason I say that is, very shortly after this, he went to law school for a year, just long enough to pass his bar exam. Then he dropped out of law school and took a job with a law firm. And a couple of his fellow law clerks, he's a very junior assistant, they remembered him telling them that he was going to be president someday. And he explained how he was going to get to be president. He said, first of all, I'm going to be elected to the New York State legislature, because that's what Uncle Ted, Theodore Roosevelt, had done. And then I'm going to take a job in the national administration in Washington. In fact, I'm going to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy, because that's what Theodore Roosevelt had done. And then I'm going to come back to New York, and I'm going to be elected governor of New York. That's what Uncle Ted had done. And then I'm going to become president of the United States. And of course, that's exactly the way it played out. So Franklin Roosevelt learned from Theodore Roosevelt, first of all, that he could be president, and then, and I think this is absolutely critical in shaping Franklin Roosevelt's background and preparation for being president. Because from that fairly early age, he was essentially taking mental notes on how to be president. If you look at Franklin Roosevelt's approach to World War II, you can see that he learned a great deal from Woodrow Wilson's approach to World War I, because he had been in Wilson's administration. And so I think it's the case that, we heard in the last campaign, especially in the Democratic primary, but also in the general election, who's going to be more prepared on day one to be president? Well, I would make the argument that Franklin Roosevelt was better prepared on day one to be president than anybody else who occupied the White House. Long answer to a short question. Be careful.
No, what were their personalities? What were their personality similarities and their differences?
You can certainly appreciate this because Doug has spent a lot of time studying Theodore Roosevelt. And when's your book coming out? Summer? In June. Okay. You should, everybody, be on the lookout for it because it's going to be a great book. Well, you know that Theodore Roosevelt had a personality that was really larger than life. Henry Adams, I think it was, who once said he'd gone to lunch at the White House. And when he came back, he sort of had to wring the essence of Theodore Roosevelt out of his clothes. Because Theodore Roosevelt was very much that way. His daughter famously said, if you want to understand my father, you need to know that he has to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Well, that was Theodore Roosevelt. If Theodore Roosevelt were alive today and walked in that door, everybody in the room immediately would know that he was in the room. He just had that kind of presence. Franklin Roosevelt really wasn't that way at all. Franklin Roosevelt was a very gregarious guy. He loved to talk, but he had an odd but very effective habit when he was talking. People, when he was president or when he was governor, would come into his office and they'd sit down. Theodore Roosevelt read voraciously. He read everything. Franklin Roosevelt read, as far as I could tell, very little. He read dime store novels just as a diversion. But try as I might to figure out what was on his bedside table, what did he read? There's little indication that he read much at all. He gained his information, his intelligence from talking to people. And so he would invite, this started when he was governor of New York, and this became the basis for what was called the Brains Trust. He would have Columbia University professors come up to Albany, and he'd have them sit down at dinner. And he'd want to know what their specialty was and what their interest was. And in order to draw them out, to find out everything they knew, he would nod and he would say, yes, yes. And the result of this was when people would come into his office as governor, especially in the Oval Office when he was president, they would be trying to sell something to him, a program, some remedy for this or that. And they would listen to the president and he would say, yes. And they thought he was agreeing with them. But in fact, what he was really doing was just trying to draw them out. So they would leave the president's office convinced that the very next day the White House was going to send up some package of legislation embodying the recommendation that they had just given. And it didn't happen. And they'd be very disillusioned. They'd, well, what happened? I thought he agreed with me. So, this is the way that this is the way Franklin Roosevelt operated. With Theodore Roosevelt, it was rather different. Well, I could go on.
Well, how is it different?
Well, with Theodore Roosevelt was the one who always dominated conversations. In fact, it was when Theodore Roosevelt would have these lunches at the White House, and he would invite very distinguished people. These would be scientists and authors and diplomats and various other people, sometimes business leaders, not so many business leaders. But he would invite them, and presumably for their expertise and intelligence on all sorts of subjects, and then he would proceed to dominate the conversation. And so they'd come away saying, oh, well, okay, that was fine. I got to hear the president talk. With Franklin Roosevelt, he spoke much less. People talked to Roosevelt. In fact, the striking thing about Franklin Roosevelt was how much when he did talk, how much he could talk without giving anything away. And there was a real reserve about Franklin Roosevelt. It wasn't reserve in the sense of aloofness or standoffishness. No, he was a very friendly guy and he would talk, but nobody could figure out what he was thinking. In fact, this was, and I think it still is, the great challenge for any biographer of Franklin Roosevelt. What really was he thinking? Now, in fact, there were a couple of occasions on which his wife of, well, at this point, 30 years, Eleanor, said, I just don't know what he's thinking. Now, given the relationship between Franklin and Eleanor, she might not have been the one best positioned to know what he was thinking. But honestly, I think I don't think anybody really knew what he was thinking. And this has to do with both Franklin Roosevelt's personality and also his understanding of the role of president. I didn't use this line in the book, but on one occasion, Franklin Roosevelt invited Orson Welles, the actor and director, the Hollywood wunderkind, to the White House and took him aside. This was when Welles was at the height of his powers and fame. And Roosevelt took him aside and said, "Orson, I want you to know that you and I are the two finest actors in America." And in the first place, I think he was utterly sincere. I think he was probably true. I think he was right. And where somebody else might interpret this, and Roosevelt had plenty of critics, and this is one of the reasons I called my book Traitor to His Class, because that's the way he was viewed by 30% of America. But there were a lot of people who would have interpreted a comment like this, and it wasn't for public consumption, but they would essentially have said, yeah, well, that indicates how insincere he really was and how this is all an act. But I don't read it that way at all. I think Roosevelt understood that being president is a kind of species of performance art. And just as a violin virtuoso might be really good playing the violin in her closet, but to get on stage and to project what you know and can do with that instrument requires another set of skills. Roosevelt understood that being president requires you to fulfill certain expectations of the American people. And given the fact, we were just talking at the lunch table about how in certain parts of the American community, Roosevelt was absolutely revered. And in this respect, I think Roosevelt understood perfectly well how you play that role. And I don't think there has been a president since Roosevelt who did it any better. Ronald Reagan was quite good, but I'd give Roosevelt a slight edge there.
Here, this Roosevelt family, a Dutch Knickerbocker family, New York City. They had homes out in Long Island. How in up the Hudson River, in the case of FDR, they made their money, their ancestors, in finance. Why are the Roosevelts the ones always challenging Wall Street? Why did TR do the trust busting and FDR being willing to stand up to it when they really came out of the financial world in a way?
In the case of Theodore Roosevelt broke with family tradition in entering politics in the first place. A gentleman, and you know this perfectly well, a gentleman in Theodore Roosevelt's time didn't go into politics, especially if you lived in New York City. Because New York City was the home of Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall was arguably the most corrupt of the big city political machines. And to get involved in politics really meant getting down in the gutter and dealing with those kinds of folks. And Roosevelt was informed of this. Theodore Roosevelt was informed of this. And he said, well, if that's the way it is, if that's who governs the country, well, I want to be part of the governing class. So for Theodore Roosevelt, there was that aspect. And it was also a kind of personal challenge. He was too young to have fought in the Civil War, but he had this need to prove himself. And in fact, his younger sister, Corinne, often said that with Theodore, with her brother, there was this constant need to prove that he was as strong, as brave, as accomplished as he thought he ought to be. And this is one of the reasons why he did this absolutely crazy thing in 1898 of resigning a very responsible and important position in the Navy Department. He was number 2 person in the Navy Department to go fight in Cuba. He had to do it. He had been an apostle of the strenuous life of military victory as the highest form of human achievement. And he had to see if he could do it. He had to see if he was brave enough. He had to test himself under fire. With Franklin Roosevelt, the story is rather different. With Franklin Roosevelt, there never was this, at least I certainly never detected in him, this notion that he had to prove to himself that he was strong and brave. With Franklin Roosevelt, for the first 39 years of his life, there was this suspicion on the part of a lot of people who knew him, that as charming as he was, as good-looking as he was, as intelligent as he was in a non-bookish kind of way, there was something really lightweight, almost supercilious about him. And there were a lot of people who thought, okay, he'd be a fine number 2, but they just couldn't see him as president. The transforming event in Roosevelt's life was contracting polio at the age of 39. Because, in fact, I think it's almost fair to say that given his privileged, protected upbringing, Franklin Roosevelt had hardly spent an unhappy day in his life until 39. And then all of a sudden, wham, he contracts polio. And polio was a childhood illness. In fact, the common name for it in those days was infantile paralysis. And for an adult to contract polio was quite rare, but when an adult did contract polio, it was often devastating. And Roosevelt was physically devastated. He never took another step unaided in the rest of his life. And this was someone who had been quite athletic, quite vigorous. He loved to play golf. He was a sailor. He ran around doing this, that, and the other thing. He was a very kinetic kind of guy. And for the rest of his life, he was essentially chained to a chair. So it made him, first of all, realize that bad things can happen to people through no fault of their own. And this was absolutely critical, I think, in his appreciation for what the Great Depression did to people. Because the Great Depression wiped out millions of Americans who had done nothing wrong, who had done everything they were supposed to do. The layoffs in industry. The unemployment rate when Franklin Roosevelt became president was 25%. It's quite bad in the United States today. It's 8.5% or maybe pushing 9%. But 25% is something entirely different. And most of those people who got laid off, they had been doing their jobs. They had been doing what was expected of them. And then out of the blue comes this economic disaster that deprives them of their work. And people who lost money in the stock market. Well, you might say that they knew that stocks were risky and stock prices can go down as well as going up. But what about all those people, numbering in the millions, who were wiped out when their banks collapsed? In fact, during the 1920s, people who didn't play the stock market, they were saving for their retirement, and didn't play the stock market, they were going to be more conservative. They didn't want to take risks. They realized that the responsible thing to do was put your money in a nice, safe savings account. And then the banks collapsed on them, and they were wiped out as well. There was no Social Security in those days, so you lost your nest egg, you were essentially out on the street, and you hadn't done anything wrong. Roosevelt could appreciate this because he had felt that kind of reverse in his own life. And one last thing having to do with this, and that is Roosevelt's polio. Roosevelt's disability made him an individual with whom other people could identify. It gave him greater insight into ordinary Americans' lives, but it also gave ordinary Americans a sense, here's somebody who is kind of like me. We've talked about why people vote for the presidential candidates they vote for. And I think a large part of this has to do with they see in the candidate they vote for something of themselves or something about themselves that they like to be. It's not strictly, in fact, it's not, I would say, primarily a matter of what policies does this person espouse. It's almost a form of identification. And people could identify with Roosevelt, with the disabled Roosevelt, in a way they hadn't been able to with the hale and hearty Roosevelt.
I think you've done a great job of telling us these two key things to keep in mind with FDR. One is that he had TR in his ancestry, and he was prepared in an unusual way to perhaps be president from being around a former president. His disability allowed him to be in touch with the downtrodden of America at the time of the economic collapse. Tell us about the New Deal, Roosevelt's way of responding to it, and I want to get into Barack Obama because Obama is seized upon FDR and the way he confronted things as something for our times, and so if you could address that also.
When Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated president, this was in early March 1933, the banking system of the United States was in something between paralysis and free fall. The banking sector today has been troubled, but for the most part, the people who have suffered from the troubles of the banking system have been bank shareholders. Bank depositors haven't lost any money. But bank depositors, the ordinary folks in Roosevelt's day, had lost money and were losing money. Thousands of banks had gone bankrupt, meaning that the depositors were simply out. They didn't have any money, and there was no deposit insurance in those days. If you had your money in a bank and that bank closed its doors, you were stuck. That was it. The first thing Roosevelt did upon becoming president in March of 1933 was to declare a national bank holiday. This, a nice euphemism, but basically what he did was he ordered the banking industry of the United States closed. The way to save the banks, to prevent the runs on banks, was simply to lock the doors. And if depositors can't get in, they can't demand their deposits back. So everybody knew that this was a Band-Aid. This was a temporary fix. The second thing that he did was to call Congress into emergency session. And within 3 days, he sent up a bank reform bill. And this was a bill by which the federal government would first of all close the weakest banks, the ones, to use our terminology, most burdened with toxic assets, and then take the other banks, the other marginal banks, and fold them into the stronger banks. And the strongest banks would be reinforced with federal money. The U.S. government bought preferred stock in the stronger banks. And then a timetable for reopening the banks was announced. And all this took place so quickly that when the House of Representatives voted on the banking bill, the bill itself hadn't come back from the government printing office. And the members of the House, in fact, voted on a wadded-up newspaper. This is the bill. This is what we're voting on. But they had sufficient faith in Roosevelt that they said, okay, we're going to take the president at his word. This is what we want. And they voted on it. This was on Friday. The next thing that happened was Roosevelt, I'm almost tempted to say that Roosevelt waved a magic wand. But it wasn't a magic wand. What it was a magic microphone. The most important thing that Roosevelt did during his 100 days, and the 100 days has become a benchmark for the beginning of a presidential administration. A benchmark entirely because Roosevelt, this special session of Congress in Roosevelt's first term lasted 100 days. The most important thing he did was to deliver a radio address. This took place on the first Sunday of Roosevelt's presidency. Now, I'm sure you all know or have heard about Roosevelt's fireside chats, and you may have this idea that they're kind of like the weekly radio addresses that presidents since Ronald Reagan have given. I have to tell you, they were nothing like that at all. In the first place, they weren't weekly. Roosevelt carefully rationed out his performances, and they were performances on the radio. The fireside chats came along about 3, maybe 4 times a year. So they were big deals when they happened. The other thing, of course, was that radio was the only important broadcast medium of the day. Now, radio is something that allows a speaker, a president, for example, to get inside the heads of an audience in a way that television doesn't. Television is kind of a distant, a rather cool medium because it's almost as though there's too much input. You see the picture. It's like, I'm sure some of you have read novels that were subsequently made into movies. When you read it, you imagine what the characters look like. And then you're faced with, oh, well, no, that's not what I imagined at all. Okay. One of the miracles of the internet age is that you can go on the internet and very easily find and listen to Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats. And I did this a long time. I had this idea that what we ought to do is something that I would call experimental history, where we would somehow place ourselves back in the past and see what it was like and maybe make decisions. And I did this experiment because I have to set the scene for you. It's a Sunday night. It's in the middle of March, 1933. The country is in the deepest depression. There are millions of people unemployed. There are millions of people homeless. Even those people who have jobs are often skimping on food. They're skimping on fuel. And one of the ways that you can save fuel and you can save on food is when it's cold, you go to bed early. You turn out the lights, turn off the electricity, turn down the heat, and go to bed. It's a Sunday night. Everybody knows that Franklin Roosevelt is going to come on the radio that night. And so, around the country, there are all sorts of people who are already under the covers. And they're listening to this voice on the radio. I said experimental history. I tried this experiment because you can do it on the internet. You have to hook up your computer. And I turned out the lights and I listened. And it was really almost like, you can imagine, it's like a bedtime story. And it was kind of an odd bedtime story. It was a 14-and-a-half-minute address in which Franklin Roosevelt, and you really ought to listen to this, because it was a masterpiece of concision and of explanation. In the first couple of minutes, Roosevelt explained how the banking industry works and how people deposit their money and the banks take the money and lend it out, and how banks are constantly caught between the fact that they borrow short-term and lend long-term. And so if the depositors want their money back, it's not there. And this is how runs on banks occur. And then he explained what had gone wrong. He went on further to explain what he, his administration, and the Congress had done to remedy the situation. And then he essentially turned to the American people and said, all the work that we have done, that my administration has done, all the work that Congress has done, will be for nothing without the support of you, the American people. Without your help, we can do nothing. With your help, there is nothing we cannot accomplish. And then he bade the country good night, and they turned off their radios and went to bed. The next morning, the banks were supposed to open. And the bankers got worried because even before the opening of the banks, the lines started to form. And everybody knew that the banking bill would be no solution at all if people didn't have confidence in the banks. Well, the most remarkable thing occurred, because when the banks began to open, in fact, it became apparent that those people standing in line weren't there to take their money out of the banks. They were to put their money into the banks. They had decided, on the basis of this bedtime story, of Roosevelt saying it's all going to be okay, that, yes, they would vote to put their confidence in Roosevelt, to put their confidence in the banks. And the banking crisis was resolved almost in the blink of an eye. Now, of course, the larger depression still persisted. That was a different and a larger story. But the banking crisis had ended, and more importantly, the mindset of America had changed. Because people began to realize, or maybe they had simply decided, on the basis of what they heard from Roosevelt, that somebody in Washington cared about them. Historians have debated the merits of Herbert Hoover's approach to the Depression and Franklin Roosevelt's approach to the Depression. And there's still a very lively debate over whether the New Deal ended the Depression, extended the Depression, or what. But there's no question that Roosevelt, even if the New Deal did not end the Depression, one of the things it did, and Roosevelt did, was to lift the despair that had settled over the country. Herbert Hoover was not able to do that. He had the wrong personality, the wrong approach. Roosevelt made that connection with the American people. And although the unemployment rate remained high for many years, people realized that things were going to be okay. And I would say it was largely because on that night in March, when they were listening in the dark, and this comforting voice came out of the dark and told them, it's all going to be okay, they believed it.
Do you think with Obama's today, who's also this larger-than-life personality, that he's learning, when he talks about FDR, do you think this is the lesson he's learned? Do you think Obama's figured out, or is he not doing enough? I mean, is he comforting the marketplace right now and people, or do you not see the analogy that the media keeps making between the New Deal and our present time?
Barack Obama might be well advised to try to emulate Franklin Roosevelt in certain respects. After all, you know perfectly well, because I know you participated in the same poll that C-SPAN did a few months ago, ranking the presidents. And for the last 30 or 40 years, when various people rank presidents, and they ask historians, they ask political scientists, they ask journalists, who are the greatest presidents? And the greatest presidents for the last 30 years have been consistently George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. And naturally, for a new president to come into office and think, boy, I could be ranked right up there, that's a heady notion. But the trouble is, if you think about it for a minute, why is it that these presidents are considered so great? It's because they guided the country through really dark times. George Washington led the country through the Revolutionary War, Abraham Lincoln through the Civil War, and Franklin Roosevelt through the Great Depression and the Second World War. So I hope Barack Obama succeeds as president, but I dearly hope that he is not considered as great a president as Franklin Roosevelt. Because if he's going to be considered as great a president as Franklin Roosevelt, then things are going to have to get a lot worse for you and me. That's just the nature of the game. It's an irony, and you know this about about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt went to his grave gnashing his teeth at Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson, by winning the election of 1912 and beating Theodore Roosevelt, had deprived Theodore Roosevelt of the opportunity to be really great. In fact, it's an odd, and you know the story, about how Theodore Roosevelt was a pretty gracious loser right after the election of 1912. And in fact, and he knew that third-party candidates don't win. He had set a record by coming in second, defeating the incumbent president. And he also knew in his moments of real honesty that his policies didn't differ that much from Woodrow Wilson's. So Wilson's victory was a victory for progressivism. But Theodore Roosevelt became embittered after the outbreak of war in Europe, because then it became apparent that whoever was president of the United States was going to have an opportunity to stamp his mark on history. And Theodore Roosevelt said, it could have been me. But it wasn't. And so Theodore Roosevelt, the thing that Theodore Roosevelt knew about his 7.5 years as president was, they were times of peace and prosperity. And this is great for the American people, but bad news for your historical reputation. So, if things are going to be good for all of us, as opposed to Barack Obama's historical reputation, we all hope that this recent recovery on Wall Street spreads through the rest of the economy, and everybody looks a year from now, or 2 years from now, 5 years from now, that was a close call. And it turns out that the recession of 08 and 09 didn't become the Great Depression. If that happens, Barack Obama will be deprived of his opportunity to be ranked as one of the really great presidents. And that's what we can all hope for. Now, the other option is that, and I will say this, Barack Obama actually has a much greater challenge than Franklin Roosevelt. Barack Obama is in a more difficult position than Franklin Roosevelt was in. Because when Franklin Roosevelt became president, things were so bad that everybody knew they could hardly get worse. And so they were willing to let Roosevelt do pretty much whatever he wanted to do. Barack Obama is in a position where, well, things are kind of scary at the moment, but they're not disastrous. After all, the unemployment rate today is not as high as it was under Ronald Reagan. And so, yeah, there are reasons to think it might get worse, but it's not worse yet. And I know that Barack Obama, I certainly believe that Barack Obama is emulating Franklin Roosevelt in certain respects and might like to be thought of as a Franklin Roosevelt, but he has to be really careful, because if things get a whole lot worse, it's entirely possible that history is going to remember Barack Obama not as the next Franklin Roosevelt, but as the next Herbert Hoover. Because, if the economy goes off the cliff, it's going to be under Barack Obama. The other thing is that Franklin Roosevelt could and essentially did ignore foreign policy for his first term. And in the 1930s, that was entirely possible. It was almost actually required of an American president, because the country was deeply isolationist. Roosevelt himself was not. Roosevelt was an internationalist. He'd been a strong supporter of the League of Nations, and he, in fact, campaigned on the platform of support for the League of Nations and American membership in the League of Nations when he ran for vice president in 1920. But the country had turned away from international affairs, and that suited Roosevelt quite well. I was struck when Barack Obama was in London the week before last for the meeting of the G20. The G20 meeting in London in early April was very similar to a conference, a summit conference that was held in 1933, also in London. And that particular conference was called the International Monetary and Economic Conference. And the goal of that conference was quite similar to the goal of the recent G20 meeting, where the idea was to get the major economic powers to agree on a cooperative approach to dealing with what then was a global depression, what now is a global recession anyway. And Franklin Roosevelt pulled the plug on that particular summit meeting. Roosevelt said the United States is not going to play ball. The United States is going to adopt a frankly nationalist approach to dealing with the Depression. Roosevelt was in a position to be able to do it politically because that was the popular thing in the United States, and economically because the United States in the 1930s was the world's largest creditor. Now the United States is the world's largest debtor. When you owe people money, you have many fewer degrees of freedom than when people owe you money. But Roosevelt had this luxury of being able to ignore the world for the first 3 or 4 years. The United States is so deeply involved in world affairs today that Barack Obama might like to ignore the world, but the world's not going to let him get away with it. And so I'm sure he would like to focus on economic affairs. But everybody knows if something untoward happens tomorrow in Afghanistan or Pakistan or pick another point of the world, then all of a sudden, perhaps, the economy might have to be pushed to the side and he's going to have to deal with some crisis.
What about bailouts we see with Barack Obama bailing out companies, bailing out industries, the auto industry, insurance industries could be happening here soon. Did FDR do any of that kind of bailing out of companies?
Roosevelt's initial approach to dealing with the crisis of the Great Depression was rather different. What he persuaded Congress to pass was something called the National Industrial Recovery Act, which created the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. And this reflected Roosevelt's experience during the First World War. Roosevelt had been in Washington and was part of an administration that essentially commandeered the American economy to gear up toward the war effort. And in Roosevelt's thinking, and in the thinking of most economists and most people who had been alive at the time, it was a very successful experiment in a centrally directed economy. It was focused for the purpose of war. And so the government would say, okay, we're going to build this much of that, and this is what's going to happen. And it worked pretty well for the 18 months that the United States was involved in the First World War. And Roosevelt thought that that's the way we should deal with it. There should be this. He wouldn't go so far as to centrally command the economy, but the NRA essentially created or attempted, it wrote codes for the different major industries. And these codes became the basis for a kind of cartelization of the big industries, steel, autos, coal, textiles, you name it, where the big producers would agree to divide up the market. There was this belief, and Roosevelt was a believer, that the problem was excess capacity. And so somebody had to cut back on production. This was implemented in the agricultural bill that Roosevelt passed. And this became the basis for American farm policy from then until now. Pay farmers not to produce. And Roosevelt was trying to apply the idea to industry as well. This policy sputtered along. It gained a certain kind of popular support. It didn't do a whole lot for the economy, and it was put out of its misery when the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in 1935. In terms of bailouts, one of the things that strikes me about Barack Obama is it's his ambivalent approach to big finance and less so to big industry. He's taking a more favorable view of GM than of some of the big banks. But Roosevelt, in contrast to Obama thus far, Roosevelt took a much more combative tone toward, those people that he called the economic royalists. Roosevelt understood something about American politics that successful, I'll call them transforming presidents, have understood. But it's something that doesn't reflect all that well on us as citizens of the United States. And that is, to get anything really big done in politics, you've got to identify and isolate enemies. You can't say we're all in this together. Nothing happens by consensus. When you seek consensus, nothing happens. Now, for Barack Obama, I suspect that this cuts against the grain of his personality, but it's also the difference between a candidate and a president. When you're a candidate, the tendency is to say to everybody who comes up to you, if I might coin a phrase, yes, we can. You promise everything to everybody. But once you're president, once you're governing, the operative phrase is to selected people, no, you can't. And Roosevelt wasn't quite so combative at first. But as Wall Street labeled him a traitor to his class, and as Republican conservatives dug in their heels against his policies, he realized that he had this majority behind him, and he could keep the majority mobilized by targeting those people who opposed him. And so Roosevelt really took part in fact, exacerbated what has to be called class politics, even class warfare. This is something that is generally considered these days to be, well, something you ought to keep away from. But it may well come to that. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Here's where personalities and politics come into play. Roosevelt was quite willing to play that game. And Barack Obama, maybe not. We'll see.
My last question, then we're going to open it up. You had the New Deal and all these programs, the CCC and the AAA and TVA, the alphabet soup of the New Deal, and yet everybody here in the audience knows what the term New Deal means. It was packaged well. I've been noticing that Obama has yet and seems to refuse to want to package all of his economic policy in a slogan. Do you think that's smart of Barack Obama, or does that kind of simplistic kind of rubric banner not really necessary?
Well, the first thing that I will say is that one of the reasons the New Deal seems so clear to us in retrospect is that people like you and me, historians, have decided that's what we're going to call it, and we teach it and we say, okay, this is the New Deal. At the time it was unfolding, there was this label for the New Deal. It was taken from one of Roosevelt's campaign addresses. But as it was unfolding, nobody knew exactly what it was. It was unclear, I think, even to Roosevelt himself what it was. Roosevelt was a great pragmatist. He didn't have any agenda when he came into the White House. He did have a philosophy and an approach. But if you look at various parts of the New Deal, some are quite clearly regulatory and intended to be permanent. The Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, FDIC. These were going to restructure in the Wall Street and the banking industry. Social Security. This is a system of transfer payments. This is a way of ensuring income to people. And this was intended to be permanent as well. There were other things that were just short-term fixes. The CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, was a way to put young people to work, young people who hadn't yet acquired habits of work or idleness. And Roosevelt certainly thought that better to put them to work, even if their work isn't all that productive. Still, get them in a situation where they have to show up and they get a paycheck for working. This is very important. That was a stopgap measure. There was a strong debate within the Roosevelt administration through his entire first term whether the New Deal ought to engage in deliberate deficit spending. Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, was a deficit hawk. He said, we've got to bring that deficit down. There were those people like Henry Wallace and Harry Hopkins who were essentially Keynesians before Keynes was generally accepted. They said, no, we've got to spend more. The problem with the Depression is there's a shortfall in demand. And if private demand doesn't do it, public demand has to. Roosevelt was torn. And one of the things that frustrated the investing classes, those people who were trying to decide whether to get back in the stock market, whether to build another factory or refinery, they didn't know exactly which way the president was going to go. And in fact, this is an argument that is still made against Roosevelt and the New Deal. Those people who had money and who were sitting on the sidelines didn't know which way Roosevelt was going to jump next. So, the New Deal looks more coherent in hindsight. Does Barack Obama have something equivalent in mind? I would say yes, if you listen to his speeches. It's very clear he wants to reform national health care. It's very clear that he wants to reform education. He wants to do something about the energy sector. And if he were to get all of those, I have a hunch that you and me, should we live long enough to write the histories of this period, will come along and say this is Barack Obama's, you fill in the two-word phrase, New Deal or something like that.
Very good. We've got a microphone over here, and we'd love to field a few questions. Just there, we'll begin.
Okay, so I'm kind of struggling not with something you said, but with something going on in the country right now. I grew up with a Roosevelt and FDR idolizing father who himself had a father who demonized FDR. So I've kind of heard it both ways. By the time I got edumacated, as we say, I had pretty much accepted that the New Deal was the right thing at the right time that did the right thing for America, historically. And I didn't hear that from my dad. Now when people talk in the public debate about the New Deal and FDR and how it should be a model with all the different things we could do to it and with it, there's always somebody else who will tell you that the New Deal certainly ruined America, was Marxist, prolonged the Depression, and pretty much destroyed anything that matters in America, that those things that Ronald Reagan couldn't somehow save miraculously. And how do we possibly use the New Deal in any way that's meaningful if people can't even seemingly begin to agree whether it even worked?
The first thing I'll say in response to that is that the New Deal is important if people are still arguing about it. Issues become non-controversial only after everybody who thought they were important has died. And so, we don't argue about whether the Bank of the United States, the early 19th century, was a good deal or a bad deal. I mean, that's dead and gone. And we don't argue that much about the progressive reforms of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, because it's one of the reasons that Theodore Roosevelt can be embraced by both parties. Franklin Roosevelt is too close to us, and the issues that he had to deal with are still too much live issues. There are the question you pose raises a couple of different aspects to it. What was the New Deal, or did the New Deal work? How are we supposed to understand the New Deal? Herbert Hoover, the incumbent who lost to Roosevelt in 1932, at the time, in 1932, and for the rest of his life, he lived on and on and on and on in California, only dying in the 1960s. He went to his grave believing that he had solved the problem of the Depression and that the economy was turning around. And in fact, there was some economic data from the summer of 1932 suggesting that, maybe things were getting better. But it was only the election of that radical populist, Franklin Roosevelt, that then scared Wall Street and threw the economy back on its back. And it didn't recover after that. And this is an argument that conservatives, especially Republicans now, have revived. And they've made this argument. It's a wonderful argument for the sake of scoring political points, because it's utterly non-disprovable. It supposes something that didn't happen. Okay, if there was no New Deal, then they can say whatever they want, because it's an aspect of logic that if you falsify the premise, then the whole syllogism cannot be disproved. So, a fair question is, was the New Deal the right thing for the United States at the time? I'm going to provide two versions of an answer to that question. One is, the central tenets of the New Deal have been essentially up for political grabs from the mid-1930s until the present. and they have never been overturned. The American people have had every opportunity to get rid of what was left of the New Deal. And I would just look at Social Security. Social Security is probably the signature program reform of the New Deal. It was established in 1935. And the American people have had any number of opportunities. You don't like Social Security? You can vote against Social Security. Former President Bush, George W. Bush, made it a fundamental policy, attempted policy of his second term to try to, now he knew he had to be careful. He didn't want to say we're going to privatize Social Security, but that's in essence what he was attempting at least to start on. And we know that that didn't go anywhere. There's, I think, a very interesting part of the story here, and I make this point in the book, and that is that so here's my own counterfactual. It's not directly related to yours, but it is sort of. So if you'll bear with me for a moment. Franklin Roosevelt would have been considered simply a mediocre president if not for something that happened that was utterly beyond his control and that happened outside the realm of American politics. It was a historical accident that Franklin Roosevelt is seen as the great president, that he's seen as great in terms of having this great impact on American life. And now this historical accident that I refer to is a rather big accident. It goes by the name World War II. But it's an accident from the standpoint of American domestic politics. I'm going to sketch a scenario for you. Suppose there had been no World War II. With no World War II, Franklin Roosevelt would have had to leave office after 2 terms. And in 1940, the American economy was still, it wasn't as bad off as it had been in 1933. But the unemployment rate was, well, it was starting to come up in 1940 because World War II had started overseas. But if no World War, then the unemployment rate probably would have still been above 15%. Roosevelt would have left office because under the George Washington 2-term rule, that's all you get. He would have left office, and the central task of the president during the Depression, would have been unfulfilled. And Roosevelt would have gone out of office and would have been seen as, at best, mediocre, maybe even a real failure. But, there's something else that would have happened. What was left of the New Deal would have been rapidly dismantled. Social Security was established by an act in 1935. The first payout to a pensioner in Social Security occurred not till 1940. Suppose Roosevelt had left office after the 1940 election. There was almost no constituency at that point, more precisely, no really invested constituency in Social Security. The Republicans were hostile to the idea of Social Security, and they certainly would have run on a platform of, what has Social Security done for you besides pick your pocket? And that's exactly where Social Security was in 1940. So imagine, no war, Roosevelt leaves office, Social Security is dismantled. There's something else that happens. The economy is still in the doldrums, so Roosevelt, he doesn't get credit for reviving the economy. The economy was revived during World War II. Roosevelt in real life is still in office. So Roosevelt gets credit for reviving the economy. There's something else that happens. One of the big concerns about Americans regarding the New Deal was it expanded the size of government. The typical budget deficit, the annual budget deficit in Roosevelt's first 2 terms before the war, was about $2 billion. $2 billion. It seemed like a lot of money at the time. After the war began, the typical budget deficit, the annual budget deficit, was over $20 billion. So the size of government during the war just dwarfs the size of government under the New Deal. So with all this stuff with the Second World War, Roosevelt gets 2 more terms in office. And by the time the Democrats finally get pushed out of office in the early 1950s, Social Security now is paying millions, tens of millions of paychecks every month. Dwight Eisenhower was president in 1953. Robert Taft, one of the original opponents of Social Security, was an important senator from Ohio. And he came up to Eisenhower and said, okay, here's our chance. We can finally dismantle Social Security. And Eisenhower said, you've got to be crazy. Americans have come to depend on Social Security. Okay, so let's see. I was answering your question. And, the other half of the answer is that Suppose there had been no New Deal. Would the Depression have ended? Well, I suppose eventually, but I can only suppose. Think about the experience that Roosevelt and his generation had. The American industrial economy had existed for about the same length of time that Franklin Roosevelt had been alive. And he was born in 1882. And industrialization occurred in the United States from about 1872 into the 20th century. And if you looked at the behavior of the American economy from 1882, let's say, until the 1930s, there were these periodic crises that kept getting worse. They kept getting deeper and longer. If you looked out on the American economy in 1933 and said, is this thing going to revive on its own? You couldn't confidently say, yes, it will. In fact, there might have been one of those cases where the gyrations of the economy just get worse and worse and worse until the thing self-destructs. We know that things eventually got better, and it's tempting to read back, well, the business cycle always comes back. But nobody knew that in 1933, and one of the reasons we know that the business cycle always ends and things get better is, well, because some of the things that prevent, I said early on, that the unemployment rate in this country is around 8 and 9%, but it was 25% in Roosevelt's day, and the chances of it getting anywhere near 25% today are, we hope, almost nil. But what's to prevent it from getting that high? Precisely those New Deal programs, like Social Security, like FDIC, that keep the system under control. It's hard to argue with the success of the New Deal as stabilizing the American economy and providing the conditions for long-term growth. There has never been a large economy in world history that performed better than the American economy did from 1940 until, well, you pick your moment. I'd say even until today. The American economy has been the huge success story of world history in the 20th century. And I have to think, well, ascribing causation in history is really hard. But whatever Roosevelt did, it certainly didn't screw up the economy.
We're going to take one more question, if there's somebody who has one. Anybody with a...
I talked him to death, Doug.
Nah. Anyone with a follow-up? Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'd be curious to get your opinions on one other subject that people still argue about, and whether that was because when Roosevelt was close to dying, he was so sick and was relying on dubious advisors or radical advisors, whether he truly was duped by Stalin and lost Eastern Europe.
The question whether Roosevelt was mistaken, was fooled, was duplicitous, was traitorous during the last months of his presidency, specifically at the Yalta Conference of February 1945, is something that has been argued about from February 1945 until the present. The central charge against Roosevelt at Yalta is this, that Roosevelt went to Yalta and sold out Eastern Europe to Stalin. And he either did this knowingly because he was a closet communist. Now, it's really only fringe groups that take this view. Or he did it unknowingly, perhaps because he was sick and dying. Now, in terms of Roosevelt sick and dying, I have to offer a slight corrective there. Roosevelt did die in April 1945, and he was sick in February 1945, and it's tempting to say he was dying in February 1945. I think that's a mistake. Roosevelt died of a massive stroke. Okay? He had had high blood pressure for several years. There was nothing in his physical condition that said he was going to die in April 1945 or even in calendar 1945. He had survived high blood pressure for several years. People live with high blood pressure. He was doing all that medical science could do in those days to deal with it. He lost a bunch of weight. He cut the salt out of his diet. He tried to take afternoon naps to relieve his stress. So the thing that killed Roosevelt wasn't something that one could have said, he's only got 3 months to live. Okay, so we'll put that aside. Secondly, when Roosevelt went to Yalta, it's true that he wasn't at his sharpest and best. When Roosevelt was at his best, he was really, really good. When he was at Yalta, he was just really good. And I say this because I think the way to interpret Roosevelt's performance at Yalta is making the best of a bad hand in the following sense. Roosevelt understood that there was no way the United States was going to force the Soviet Red Army out of Poland. And Poland became the touchstone of this argument because the war in Europe had started over the invasion of Poland, and the war ended with Poland under Soviet control. At the time of Yalta, Stalin's army occupied Poland. The U.S. army had yet to reach Berlin. And Roosevelt understood that he didn't have the troops to march into Poland and drive Stalin out, and more to the point, he didn't have the American political support to do it. Americans were tired of the war. It had been a very costly war. If Roosevelt had said, if he had followed the advice ascribed to Patton, let's march to Moscow, he probably would have been impeached. Because no, the Soviet Union was America's ally. What are you doing turning on the Soviet Union? Roosevelt did get from Stalin an agreement to hold elections in Poland. Now, this was subsequently interpreted as, boy, Roosevelt is a fool to think that Stalin is going to hold elections. Roosevelt understood that was the best he could hope for. He couldn't get Stalin to agree to evacuate Poland. From the Russian standpoint, Poland had been the corridor through which Russia, the Soviet Union, had been invaded ever since Napoleon. And Stalin wasn't going to give it up. But Roosevelt did get Stalin to agree to hold elections. And when the elections were not held, then Truman, because Roosevelt was dead by this time, could say, the Soviets are the ones who went back on their promise. It gave the United States, if nothing else, a little bit of moral leverage. One last thing here. Roosevelt's principal job in going to Yalta was not to deal with Poland. It was partly to try to arrange how are we going to defeat Germany, because the war with Germany was still on. His main task was to get an agreement from the Soviet Union to enter the war against Japan. The Soviet Union had not declared war on Japan, and the United States, Truman, looked forward to a very costly and long end game against Japan. It was becoming clear in the Pacific how bitterly the Japanese were going to fight. And the American military and naval planners were projecting an invasion of the Japanese home islands that would go on well into 1946, conceivably into 1947. And Roosevelt believed that he needed to get the Soviet Union to enter the war against Japan to keep the Japanese pinned down in China, so they couldn't take all of their troops in China and move them back to the Japanese home islands. Now, 4 months later, 5 months later, it turned out, and Roosevelt got that agreement. It was part of a secret codicil to the Yalta Accords. 5 months later, it turned out that that was unnecessary because the atomic bomb forced the Japanese to surrender before the Soviets really engaged the Japanese. In February 1945, no one, not Robert Oppenheimer, not Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, certainly not Franklin Roosevelt, could put any serious confidence in the atomic bomb as a war-winning weapon. It hadn't been tested. It was months away from being tested. So any prudent commander-in-chief would do whatever he could to get the Russians to agree to enter the war against Japan. That was the context. Things changed with Roosevelt's death. Things changed with the atomic bomb. But I happen to think, well, Roosevelt himself, he came home and he told his advisor Adolf Berle, he said, you know, I did the best I could. It wasn't particularly good, but it was the best I could. Roosevelt understood that's what had happened in Yalta, and it was, I think, the best he could do under the circumstances.
Well, look, I want to thank Bill, and you can see how lucky his students are to take American history classes with him. I consider Bill Brands and
where's Meredith? Ask Meredith. She was one of my students. There you go. Were you lucky, Meredith?
She was one of the...
there you go. Louder, please.
Meredith here at the Baker Institute was one of Bill's students. Say hi, Meredith. Hey, thank you all for coming. And Bill, thanks so much. We want to have you back soon.
Thanks, Doug. Thank you.